Welcome back. Welcome back, class. It is the second lecture of week 4 of our Old Testament course, and we left off with Gideon as one of the judges. Had a little break in the video, so we'll just pick up moving forward with Gideon. But this is a reminder in case you missed that last blank. He is a faithful commander. What we're going to see now is another one of the famous judges who we will see starts off well and does not finish exactly well, but does ultimately honor God in a quite strange way. We see, first of all, something about Samson is that he is very strong indeed. Read chapter 14 and 16, where we're going to see his faith played out, but through strength, through the brute strength that he has, but that brute strength is a gift from God that is symbolic through his long hair, this Nazirite vow. Now, a lot of questions there on what that means, but we do know that it's not actually because of his hair that he had strength, it's because of God. And when he allowed his hair to be cut, it was a sign that he was not trusting in God. Also, that he was giving into his weakness, and that was his desire for women, that it's an unethical and unbiblical way, and that is his downfall. Once he loses his strength, his eyes are gouged out, and it seems that all is over for Samson. But as the story plays out, he ultimately will not be remembered as the judge who sat on a bench and found people innocent or guilty, but as the one who, with his final act of courageous faith, takes his strength and brings the walls down, killing the enemies of his people. We find those examples through the book of Judges. But I want us to look at the very last verse of the book, which really gives us an understanding of what is the entire view of Judges when you bookend it with the verses we saw earlier. Earlier, we saw that they grew up, many of them, not all of them, of course, because as we saw in the life of Gideon, there were people that had heard reports. So they did tell a little, but overall, most did not tell the great victory stories of God. What we do see is that they were without God because they neglected him. They intermarried into people of unlike faith. They adopted the worship of the false gods, and destruction came upon them. There were times of peace when a judge would rise up at the hand of God and bring the people back to unity. But the last verse of Judges really helps us understand what was the issue, what was the problem. And in verse 25 of chapter 21, it says this: "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." Now, the first part of that sentence is a reflection upon what is going to come, that Israel is going to be led by a king. And as we're going to see, that even in and of itself was not a positive thing to begin with. However, it is better than what we find here, where everyone just does as they see fit. That is not a good idea, and that is damaging to the people as they simply look upon what they are doing as okay, regardless of what it is, whether it lines up with the laws of Moses or not, simply doing as they think. The biblical message is people just cannot, in their own power, make all wise decisions. Make some wise decisions, but not all wise decisions. And therefore, there needed to be guidance. That guidance first came in the direct path of God, as you see in the beginning of Genesis. And then it came through the law of Moses. And then it came through Judges, sometimes faithfully, sometimes not. And then we're going to be moving into a time of kingdom. Before we get there, however, we have to see the family tree of the kingdom. And so we're in the midst of these writings, the historical writings. Remember, law, prophets, and writings. And we have got through the law, we're not yet to the prophets. And we're here in Joshua, Judges, Ruth. These are 3 of the writings of the Old Testament, which are neither law nor prophecy. They're telling a history, telling what's going on with the people. And one of the one of the things we're going to see is this jewel of a book known as Ruth, named after the heroine of the story, who starts off in humble state. She is a person who is outside the people of God. She is a Moabite, but she becomes part of the great story. One of the things we need to see in this context is that she is a person that is going to be the family tree of David, of King David. And we see that that is significant not only because of the role she plays in that, but also because of where it is. We see that there is going to be this image of Bethlehem, this town of Bethlehem. I want to share a writing from a previous text about why Ruth was written. And this paragraph reads, "The story of Ruth showed the people it was written for, the people of Israel, how God can use not only the Jews, but people of other nations to work out God's plans in the world. Ruth was not from any of the tribes of Israel, but from Moab. She left the security of her own family to live in Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and to take care of this childless widow." The last verses of the story, chapter 4, verse 13 through 22, tell how Ruth and her descendants became ancestors of Israel's greatest king, David. So how did she enter the story? Well, chapter 1, we find out that Naomi loses her husband, and so she needs to go back to her own people. And we see that Ruth here, along with her sister, these were the sister-in-laws of Naomi, or daughters-in-law of Naomi. They are best going and back to their own people as far as a future, humanly speaking. That's their best choice. But Naomi is going to leave, and Ruth says, "I'm going to go with you." So listen to a portion of the story. It says in verse 3, "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out to the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband.' Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, 'We will go back with you and your people.'" Now, ultimately, Orpah does not, but Ruth does. And this is where that story begins. This is the amazing story of Ruth. One of the things that happens in this is she finds Boaz, an old man considerably older than she, and he seeks to protect her as he notices her beauty and her kindness. And so he has some of his workers keeping an eye on her so that no one harms her, and allows her, as a person of low income, to glean from the outside of the fields and to be taken care of. And she in turn takes care of Naomi. So you see two people caring for one another. This Boaz, number 3 in your notes, he is referred to as a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer. This is chapter 3, verse 12. Okay. In chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer," that's a kinsman redeemer, a guardian redeemer of our family, there's another who is more closely related than I. And so there is this understanding that he doesn't have first rights to her. He cannot marry her until he gives the option to the one closer in the line of the kinsman redeemer or the guardian redeemer. And they tell it in a story so the other person chooses not to, and that opens the door for their relationship. Going back to chapter 2, verse 1, it explains a little bit more. It says, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain, find anyone in whose eyes I find favor. So there is favor that comes upon her through Boaz. And then chapter 3, verse 9, there is this moment where Ruth, at the urging of Naomi, makes herself vulnerable and goes to see Boaz. And at chapter 3, verse 9, it says, who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. So spread the corner, show this protection. It's symbolic and literal that you're going to put your covering over me. You're going to take care of me. One of the issues we find is this idea of the covering of protection. This is here a great symbolic act, but has already been taking place, as I mentioned before, by making sure she had food enough for herself and for Naomi, to make sure no one harmed her as she worked the fields. And this is a completion of that. And what we find at the very end of the book is the valuable statement, which really tells us why the book of Ruth is in the Bible in the first place. It says, a woman living there says, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, Naomi did not give birth to a son. Ruth did, but Naomi's family is restored through this, and the child is named Obed. And his father was Jesse, and Jesse was David. Notice this. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Abinadab. Abinadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Solomon. Solomon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. As we'll see later in the story, as we get to Samuel, we'll find that David's going to be anointed, but he is not the only son. But we see from Ruth's book here that he is the son that makes most important to the story of God's redemption story. Number 4, it's a genealogy of Jesus and genealogy of David. It's a genealogy of David and the genealogy of Jesus, as we see in Matthew chapter 1. What we need to understand here is that out of this story is going to become the true understanding that out of the line of Ruth, out of the line of Boaz, out of the line of these people group is going to come the Mashiach, which is a word that later will be transitioned into the Hebrew word Messiah, which then will be the Greek Christos, which is in English Christ. And so we think of Christos as the Greek, Messiah as the Greek, Messiah, Christ. Both these terms meaning this Redeemer, this one who's come to set people free. And from a Hebrew perspective, they're waiting on that person who will be from the line of David, the son of David. From a Christian standpoint, as seen in Matthew, that has happened with the birth of Jesus. What we're now going to do is launch into a little more of the history, and this is through the book of Samuel. We find it in our Bible as 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. That's just an ease of division. In the actual original written form, remember there's not chapters and verses, nor are there books in this case. So we have really this Samuel, not 1st and 2nd. It's all one story. But the reason it's divided that way is what we see is it's really a story of the beginning of Samuel's calling and going to be a story of Saul, but then it's really going to become more and more about David. The timeline for this is between 1080 to 970 BC. You recall that I said that About 2,000 years ago, we have the historical birth of Jesus, and about 1,000 years before that, and so 3,000 years ago, approximately, we have David, and approximately 1,000 years before that, we have Abraham. So we're 1,000 years into the people of Israel, and 1,000 years until the Messiah is coming. So right in the middle of the beginning and the culmination of the promise, we find this David. There is unity in the family here. There is salvation history, and there is going to be a great resurgence of the worship of true Yahweh. What we find is Samuel, now the prophet, about whom this book is written from the beginning. And we see that he is miraculously born, not in the same way as Jesus, but his mother is barren, and God allows father and mother to conceive and give a son. And so what we find is that throughout the scripture, ultimately through Jesus with the virgin birth, throughout the scripture, often it points out that the couple's having a hard time conceiving. And when God opens that womb, and then a child comes. And usually when that happens in scripture, it means that child is going to be very significant to the story of God's people. And this is certainly true of Samuel. Now, in order for this to happen, you have a ongoing conversation, if you will, with God. And Hannah is his mother, who's deeply in desire for a child. And she promises God, if you'll just give me a child, if you just give me this pleasure of bringing a child into the world, I will dedicate this child to God, even to the point of surrendering him to the temple, in the sense of going to worship in the tabernacle, rather. And there is this beautiful imagery of her keeping that promise, and he is going to be raised by the priest Eli. And they have a close relationship. So he's adopted by Eli, and then he's called as a boy. In chapter 3, we find the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. So Eli is going to sleep, and Samuel is receiving visions from the Lord. And he receives a startling vision, in essence, that the role of the priesthood, the role of the great significance of religious leadership among the people is going to be taken out of the hands of Eli, out of the hands of his biological sons, and handed over to Samuel. Now, don't miss the connection here between Samuel's visions and Joseph's visions. Joseph's visions were told in pride. Samuel's visions were told in hesitancy. David shared the story when he shouldn't have. Samuel hesitates to share it until Eli says, you need to share the word. So we're going to jump down to verse 8 of chapter 3. It says, the third time the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lay down. And if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other time, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. The Lord said to Samuel, see, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone that hears them tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I've spoken against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by a sacrifice or offering. Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. Samuel answered, here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you. So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, he is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear in Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Notice at the beginning of this chapter, it says, those days the word of the Lord was rare. But once it is handed over, this priestly role, this prophet role is handed away from Eli's family to Samuel. And now says, Lord continued to appear and revealed himself to Samuel through the word. So God is speaking loudly again. What we have here is a transition from judges to kings. And Samuel is going to be intent in this. He's going to be very specific to this. We move forward, and what the people do is they begin to see that they're not like everybody else. Now, remember, they're called not to be like everybody else. This was the reason for dietary laws. This was the reason for the differences God set forth in Mosaic law. It's the reason for circumcision. It's the reason for Sabbath. But as is human nature, which has been touched by sin, you see the people desiring to be like everybody else. And in that day, everybody else had a king. So they want to have a king. And Samuel says, you do have a king, and that king is God. So you don't want another king. And God says, well, they're stubborn-hearted and they really want one, so give them a king. And so he picks Saul, who's tall and handsome and looks like the figure of a king, and they choose him. So Saul, as the blank says, answered to Israel's request, and he is appointed by Samuel. In chapter 9, it gives us this description of him. It says, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zehor, the son of Korath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. The people are desperate for a king because not only do they want to be like everybody else, but we see the Philistines, back a couple chapters we saw, have stolen their Ark of the Covenant, this wonderful symbol of God's presence in their lives, and they want to have somebody lead them so they can be victorious, and they choose Saul, who looks the part. But later he is rejected. One of the things that he does is he calls upon God to sacrifice when he should have waited for Samuel. I encourage you to read that portion of the story. It's fascinating to see one of the main reasons Saul no longer will have the king in his name. And we're going to find that David now rises to the surface. And this we find again in the book of 1 Samuel. First thing we need to see is he is a servant of Saul. He's not a man that comes out of some random place. He is chosen to be one who comes and serves Saul. He calms Saul through music. He works alongside him at times, and he is a companion of Saul. What we see also is that he's going to be gifted in music. We're going to see that he defeats the giant known as Goliath. Keep in mind, by giant, we mean several feet taller than the average Jewish man, not a giant in the sense of comical, but a threatening figure. And David takes him on under the power of God. And then in 1 Samuel 18, we see that Saul is jealous because of David's achievement and the people's response to it. And Saul begins to view David as an enemy. And there's some conflicting relationship details going on here, where he still wants David to comfort him through his music and through his abilities, but also at the same time, he wants to get rid of the man, and see this conflict back and forth in the soul of Saul. We see that people like David, and some people have called him the Robin Hood type individual. He was a man of the people, and he loved the people, and people responded to him well in that way. One person made this comment. It says he kills Goliath. Saul had promised a wife, but tries to get him killed by sending him out to get 100 Philistine foreskins. But David brings back 200, and Saul is jealous. And from this point, Saul tries to kill David. But David is liked by the people. He is a person who is wanting to see the people prosper, and to not be arrogant in his role in doing so. Another thing you see about David is he's a friend of Saul's son Jonathan. This is a very great relationship. In fact, in the Bible, it talks about even closer between a man and a woman. This is not a sexual type of mention. This is just saying the hearts are connected tenderly because of their understanding of one another. And Jonathan understands that his father is not being fair to David, and they bond over this. We also go to see David's mercy. In chapter 24, we see that he has an opportunity to take the life of Saul, but out of respect for the role of king, he does not take his life. And so then we move into this idea that David is the ideal king. David is the ideal king. We have Abraham as the great prophet. We have Moses as the great lawgiver, and we have David as the ideal king. These are the great people of Israelite history still looked upon by today. David's role does not begin with the entire kingdom. It begins with half of it. We find this in 2 Samuel chapter 12. Saul is the one who is in charge of the tribes other than Judah at this point, and Judah decides to follow David. The king of all Israel happens later in 2 Samuel 2 is the one where he's half tribe. 2 Samuel 5 is where he is king over all of Israel. And so if we go to 2 Samuel chapter 5, you see the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off." They thought David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David, so later called that. On that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. From Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and exalted him as king for the sake of the people, Israel. So we see David now in charge of the entire kingdom, not just a portion of the kingdom. And then we have God's promise. We want to look at this in chapter 7. It's a very powerful promise. It says, after the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies from around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in the house of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling," that's a tabernacle. "Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers whom I have commanded to shepherd my people, Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own, and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did in the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Before me, your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported to David all the words of his entire revelation. This is first going to be fulfilled through Solomon. And we see that because when it says in verse 4, when he has done wrong, if you to remove that sentence, we see the New Testament is going to look at this passage as also a foreshadowing of Jesus, who comes in the line of David. He did not do wrong, but all this other about him, about being established forever, is true. What we're also going to see in 2 Samuel is David's sin. David's sin. This is a tragic moment within the people in the history of Israel. Not insurmountable, but tragic, and shows the flaw of David and his temptation. The backstory is that David is often going off in battle. In fact, he goes with his men. But one time he stayed behind, and as he did, he was walking among his rooftop, which is a large palace, and he can see down upon the smaller homes. And there a woman is bathing, and he sees her beautiful body, and he desires her. And as king, he has her come to his house, and there they conceive. This woman's husband is Uriah, his mighty warrior. David, trying to cover up his sin, takes Bathsheba into his home and has Uriah killed on the front lines. So he's guilty of adultery and guilty of murder. And he knows this, but he keeps it secret for as long as he can. But then God reveals to Nathan what has happened. And Nathan confronts him boldly, but also cautiously. And he says, you're the man. He tells a story of a rich man with many sheep stealing the one sheep of a poor shepherd. It's an allegory, which David soon is aware that he is the rich shepherd stealing from the poor shepherd, and he repents. Read Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is David's big song of repentance. Bathsheba is going to remain his wife, and in fact, she will bear him a son. The son of the adulterous relationship dies, but she will bear him another son, and that is Solomon, who will be the next king of Israel. David's closing story is in chapter 22 through 24. We have some beautiful songs of his, which again, you'll see a whole lot more within the book of Psalms, which he wrote many of them. I want you to hear his last words as recorded in chapter 23. It says, these are the last words of David, the inspired utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, the hero of Israel's songs. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me, when one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in fear of the God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. If my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part. Surely he would not bring through fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire. But evil men are all to be cast aside like thorns, which are not gathered with the hand. Whoever touches thorns uses a tool of iron or a shaft of spear. They are burned up where they lie. You see the complexity of David, even in these words. You see musicianship, you see poetry, the work of a lyricist. You also see this, obviously, the words of a warrior, this mixture of David's primary means of living, of finding purpose. David is a good king, an ideal king, a broken man, but still to this day honored, not mainly because he was David, but because God promised David that there always be one that sits upon David's throne, which ultimately, from a Christian perspective, is Jesus, the son of David, which is why the genealogies in the New Testament that's pointing Jesus are very clear that he's in the line of David, who's in the line of Abraham, this continued story of God's redemptive story through the Hebrew people. As I said, we have another child born. This is the child of Bathsheba, again, not from the adulterous relationship, but later as they're actually married. And the blank under Solomon the king is that he is the son of Bathsheba. He's the son of Bathsheba. He's also a rival of Abinijah, and we see his mother Bathsheba being coy and working in a sly way to make sure her son becomes king. God comes to him and says to Solomon, as a young man who's going to be king, basically not as a genie in false ways, but in true ways, God comes to Solomon and says, pick what you want. And Solomon, knowing what he's about to have as responsibility, reigning as king, he asked for wisdom. Because he asked for wisdom, God honors that and says, I'm also going to give you wealth. I'm also going to give you great success. We get the image there that if he'd asked for wealth, things would not gone well. But he asked for wisdom. This is best exemplified through his role of a judge. We see that carry over between the women who both claim that a baby is theirs. And the true mother makes a decision that will spare the life of the child. Solomon has wisdom to know that is a true mother. That is a story that's put in there for us to realize that his wisdom truly was real. Like his father, he had flaws. Like all people, he had flaws. But what's going to happen is this wisdom is going to carry him through in many ways. And because of that, Solomon is going to have a peaceful reign. It is almost without any war during the life of Solomon, which helps him in his journey. So we see the blanks. He is son of Bathsheba. He is a rival to Adonijah. He has wealth and he has wisdom. We also see that there is a great project that he is going to undertake. This project was David's dream, and God, as we saw in text earlier, said, David, that's not your job. Basically, your hands are too bloody. And that is also symbolic of the fact that too much war is going on and you can't build and be at war at the same time effectively because this is a complex project. And so the temple and the blanks, you can say David's desire, but Solomon's project. David's desire, but Solomon's project. And you can read in 1 Chronicles 17 about David's desire and 2 Chronicles 6 for Solomon's project. One of the things we see about this is that there's going to be a great achievement here of building the temple. The tabernacle, the tent of dwelling, will now be a temple built in Jerusalem during a time of peace, in a very ornate building, beautiful building. And this is the most unified time in the kingdom of Israel. You have Saul, who was unified at the beginning, but fell apart. You see David, who starts as a king of Judah and then later king of all Israel. But you see Solomon as king of Israel. There's some conflict here and there, but relatively speaking, peaceful throughout. And that's important for us to notice because during the time of peace, as I said, that the temple is built. One thing to notice as you read the text is while Solomon asked for wisdom, he did, as I said a moment ago, have flaws. Where you see these flaws come out, as it did with Solomon, as it did with David, as you see back in earlier stories of the Old Testament, is men giving in to lust. And this is Solomon, where he gets hundreds and hundreds of wives, in addition to that, to concubines. And in time of peace and without purpose of war and further administration, he is simply given into his lust. And that is one of the downfalls of his kingdom. We also see some pride that comes in because while he spends about 7 years building a temple, he spends double that building a palace for himself. And he's a very flawed man. in the beginning of First Kings, chapter 11, it's going to all these things about Solomon and getting the ark back and put in the temple, and the Lord being with him and the dedication of it. And it's this beautiful illustration of what's going on well. But then there's the beginning of the kingdom's fall. And from this point forward, you see that disaster is ahead. And there's a little hint of it in chapter 11 of First Kings, verse 1. It says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Amorites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. This is a reminder that things are going well, but then you see that word, however, love many foreign women. Again, foreign, not in the sense their races are impure. The problem is that their faith is impure, and this will be a problem. So in addition to his lust, what are some reasons that the monarchy is going to fall apart? I want to give you three more. Write these down. These are three reasons why you have the kingdom fall apart in addition to his pride and his lust. Number one is excessive taxation. This is particularly for the palace because David had saved up for his son. So the expense to Solomon was not huge for the temple, but excessive taxation for the palace. Another is the cost of human freedom when you're pulling people off the farm and making them work. When you have them work on building projects that are not their own, you're having the economy going to fall apart. So excessive taxation, cost of human freedom, and you have a religious apostasy, and this is where he gives in to his harem and his wives and worships other gods. Then we find the death of Solomon as reported in chapter 11, verse 41 through 43. It says, as for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. So his successor, as that last blank, is Rehoboam. And we will look into what happens next in the life of the king of Israel and the kingdom of Israel. Make sure that you look for other documents in the folders. And thank you for being a part of this class. Next week will be both live and on Zoom. We will see you soon.